let's take it away. We'll jump right into that mass abuse of exploits where hackers are leveraging flaws in very commonly used software in order to compromise tens of thousands of endpoints around the world, millions in some cases. So Matt, do you want to give us an example of a case?
Yeah, this is a perfect case that we actually just worked through not too long ago. The case that we're going to talk about for this section is a financial advisory firm that we were working with, and they were using a mobile iron system for mobile device management and for access control into their sensitive applications. As it turns out, and as popped up in the news over the last few weeks, it was one of the many systems out there that was vulnerable to the log4j exploit. And if you're not familiar with that, we'll go into a little bit more detail on what log4j actually is here in just a second. But Mobile Iron actually notified the customer that their server was potentially vulnerable to this exploit 2 weeks after the exploit had become publicly available. So there was a 2-week period of time where there was a significant risk to the data that was contained in that server and then anything else that that server touched inside of the network itself.
So let's go back and look at the log4j vulnerability that was being exploited. Log4j, of course, was announced in December 2021, and it generated some pretty amazing headlines like "The internet is on fire." The reason for this is that number one, it's an open source project, so it did not have a huge staff maintaining it or auditing it, but it's a widely used error logging service that's used by major products all around the world. It was a component of Cisco, AWS, Google, many other major manufacturers. In fact, there's even a risk that antivirus platforms and other IT softwares that use. So really, the ripple effects of this were everywhere, and it was not easy for individual organizations to address these because, of course, you may depend on a product, but you have no direct control over when a patch will be available for this, or even necessarily know that it may be vulnerable. And this was a remote code execution vulnerability, which could potentially allow attackers to directly execute commands on the server. So, Matt, you want to walk us through what the hackers could do with this?
Yeah, of course. So as you just pointed out, this is a remote code execution vulnerability, which means that if an attacker is able to leverage this, they can execute commands remotely on whatever system it is they're going after. It basically means they can run their own scripting, they can steal credentials, move laterally, they can download and install malicious payloads, which we saw in a couple of different cases. And then as a kind of cherry on top of that sundae, they can steal data from the systems and turn it into an exposure extortion case if they so choose.
Cherry on top of the log4shell sundae. I love that. Okay, so in this case, our financial advisory firm, they've just gotten notification from Mobile Iron out of the blue. I'm sure it took them by surprise. And you hope in that case, you're like, oh, well, the attackers probably didn't find that out, right? So the big questions here are, number one, did somebody actually exploit those servers? Number two, if they did they move laterally through the network, steal any sensitive data, take over anything else? So spoiler alert, somebody hacked their servers. And that was actually quite common with Log4j and many of the other major zero-day vulnerabilities we've seen, because as soon as information about them is aware, like Exchange is a great example, adversaries are scanning for them. And in some cases, they're scanning for them even before the vulnerability is announced. So pretty scary. So by the time they found out that this was an issue, they were already hacked. So what did we find?
Well, we actually found two things inside of the server that were really notable. The first thing we found was a piece of botnet software called Mushtik. And Mushtik is traditionally associated with cryptocurrency miners. So they take over servers, whether it's Linux or Windows or whatever, and they install a Monero miner that then eats up all the CPU's processing power, greatly impacts performance on the server, and makes a little bit of money for the attacker on the back end. The other piece that we found was kind of interesting to us because this is a name that we haven't actually heard in a couple of years, or at least not in very high prominence. It was the Mirai botnet, which, if you're familiar with our history, we've had a very close relationship with that specific botnet, and we've used it for a couple of research projects.
So you can check out our talk if you're curious. I never thought that this would come back. Honestly, this is like the peanuts on the sundae near the cherry on top, because I'm so excited that cryptojacking is back and cryptojacking IoT is back. You can check out our RSA talk on it. We also made it into Scientific American, so there's a cool little article about that. So anyway, Mirai is back, and now that it's open source, hackers are using the latest vulnerabilities. They're building in new exploits, and Log4j is one of them. Okay, take us back to your case, Matt, that you handled.
Now, of course. So yeah, after we found those two individual botnets, which were both resident on the servers that we were investigating, we did a full forensic analysis of the servers. There were a couple of questions that we still needed to answer. First thing we needed to know was, did they steal anything from the servers, and then we also needed to know, did they use that access to pivot into any other systems that were connected on the network. Good news for our client at this point: there was no lateral movement identified, and there was no evidence of any data theft. From the log data that we had available, we could see the two botnets accessing the server, and we could see a little bit of other kind of suspicious looking activity. But it looked like we had caught it before anyone had actually established permanent access on that server and used it as their jumping off point to the rest of the network. Bad news, though, this was time to fully rebuild that mobile iron server. There were so many questions about the condition of the operating system and the components they were using that the client and the vendor decided mutually just to rebuild the entire system on premise. And then vendors typically don't cover forensics costs and recovery costs if there's a problem with their piece of equipment. And this is a problem for organizations that need to investigate because, well, that costs money. And there are limited options for recourse if that is something that happens. I mean, there's some litigation or some restitution you can go after, but it becomes pretty tough at that point.
Yeah, I think this is a really important point. Again, we're seeing these zero-day vulnerabilities and exploits more and more, but it's not like you can go and say to Microsoft, hey, here's how much it costs for me to remediate that. Can you please pay me? Because if that were the case, tech companies would just go out of business. It's too much risk for them to take. So really, if there is a zero-day vulnerability and you get hacked, you are on your own. And you can try to recoup some of those costs using lawsuits. We're definitely seeing that happen, but it's certainly not a sure thing. And again, if everybody did that, these tech companies would probably just go out of business. So it'll be interesting to see how the law and liability shakes out over time, I think. Don't you, Matt?
Yeah, I think so. And it's moving a lot faster. We'll go over that here in just a few, but there's some significant changes being made.
Here are top threats: mass exploit abuse, cross-cloud attacks, exposure extortion, supply chain attacks. How do you defend against this? Matt, do you want to take our defenses?
Prepare for mass zero-day vulnerabilities. This is going to happen again, so be ready for that to hit the news. Be ready to defend your network in the case that you need to. Conduct phishing training. This is hugely important. Your employees are always your first line of defense against a cyber attack. They need to have the tools in order to succeed in that battle. Phishing training and cybersecurity awareness training are the name of the game when it comes to the biggest bang for your buck you can get with a security program. Deploy a password manager. Make sure that you are giving your staff the tools they need to use strong, unique passwords for every single one of their services, and use it in your personal life too. I mean, why not? Make sure that you are implementing multi-factor authentication wherever you possibly can. The more you use it, the more you're used to it, the less of a hassle it seems, and it just becomes kind of the default for security when you have an online or connected account. Also, it will save you from a ton of hassle in most cyber attack scenarios. Routinely apply security patches, minimize your data, inventory your data and assets, know what you have, know what you need to protect, know why you need to protect it. Crank up monitoring and logging so you can see when something's going wrong. Implement data loss prevention so you know if your data is leaking out of the network, and then manage your supplier risks to put yourself in a better position moving forward, or at least in a defensible position should something happen.
Thank you so much, everyone. Again, this is Sherry Davidoff, CEO of LMG Security.
And I'm Matt Duran, Director of Training and Incident Response for LMG Security. If you have any questions, please reach out at any time. We would love to hear from you. You can reach us at info@lmgsecurity.com, find us on LinkedIn, and follow us on Twitter. Thanks again for joining, and we'll see you next time.